The screams that tore through Berkeley Castle on September 21st, 1327, woke an entire village, but not one person dared investigate. Inside the castle's deepest dungeon, England's deposed king was dying in a way so horrific that his killers had spent weeks planning every detail. The stone chamber reeked of decay. For months, they'd piled rotting animal carcasses in the pit below Edward's cell. The stench was deliberate, calculated, designed to break a king's spirit before they broke his body. 3 men entered the cell that night. One carried a horn, another gripped an iron rod. The third tended a brazier of glowing coals. Edward knew what was coming. He'd watched them heat the rod until it glowed white-hot. The horn wasn't for music. It was to protect against external wounds, because whoever planned this murder wanted something specific. A corpse without marks, a king dead without evidence. The screaming started just after midnight. It echoed off stone walls, burst through iron bars, and rolled across the September fields. Villagers pulled blankets over their heads. Guards found reasons to patrol elsewhere, because everyone knew, when you hear a king dying, you stay silent. By dawn, Edward II was dead. The man who'd inherited England's throne 20 years earlier, who'd loved the wrong people, fought the wrong battles, and defied every rule of medieval kingship, ISA, had paid the ultimate price for being different. But here's the thing. How does a king end up tortured to death in his own kingdom? How does royal blood provide no protection? You need to understand that Edward's death started decades earlier, with a father's rage and a prince who refused to be the son England demanded. The future King Edward I grabbed a fistful of his son's hair and pulled hard. The ripping sound echoed through Westminster Hall as young Edward cried out, more from shock than pain. His crime? Asking his father to grant lands and titles to Piers Gaveston, a nobody knight from Gascony. "You want to give away my lands?" The old king's voice shook Westminster's stones. To him? See, medieval princes were supposed to want specific things. War victories, political marriages, expanding territories. But Edward wanted none of that. While his father conquered Scotland, young Edward preferred thatching roofs with common workers. When nobles discussed battle tactics, Edward was learning to breed horses. The court watched their future king choose manual labour over combat training, NDC, and they were horrified. Edward's friendship with Gavaston went beyond typical royal favouritism. They shared clothes, inside jokes, a private language that excluded everyone else. The prince gave Gavaston his own jewels, his finest horses, even family heirlooms meant for future queens. Old King Edward saw what everyone saw. His son loved this Gascon knight with an intensity that threatened the throne itself. The hair-pulling incident was just the beginning. Edward I banished Gavaston from England, threatening death if he returned. The prince begged, negotiated, even attempted hunger strikes. Nothing worked. His father's message was crystal clear. Choose the throne or choose Gavaston. You cannot have both. One day, young Edward told his friend as Gavaston boarded the ship to exile, "I'll bring you back." The old king heard about that promise. He summoned his son for what witnesses called the breaking. Hours of shouting, threats of disinheritance. At one point, the king threw a chair that barely missed his son's head. But Edward had already made a decision that would haunt him to his grave. He would wait. For 7 years, Edward played the dutiful son. He attended council meetings, participated in Scottish campaigns, even agreed to marry the French princess Isabella. He learned to hide his true nature behind a mask of compliance. But everyone close to him knew the truth. The prince was counting days until his father died. "He's planning something," the Earl of Lincoln warned other nobles. "The moment the crown touches his head, everything changes." They tried to extract promises from Edward, oaths to maintain his father's policies, guarantees about appointments and territories. Edward agreed to everything with a smile that never reached his eyes. Because he knew what they didn't, promises made under duress meant nothing to a king. The court watched Edward transform during those final years. He mastered the art of saying what powerful men wanted to hear while revealing nothing of his true intentions. When discussing his upcoming coronation, he'd defer to tradition and protocol. When asked about Gaveston, he'd change the subject to tax revenues or Scottish rebels. But at night, Edward wrote letters, hundreds of them, all to Gaveston in exile. Palace servants later testified about the prince staying awake until dawn, writing by candlelight. He never sent these letters. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, he kept them locked in a chest, waiting for the day he could deliver them personally. Old King Edward died on July 7th, 1307, still campaigning against Scotland. They say his last words were instructions about governing, about being strong, about resisting favourites and flatterers. His son wasn't there to hear them. Edward was already racing south to claim his throne and to keep a 7-year promise. What the court didn't know was that this was just the beginning. Within hours of his father's death, Edward II dispatched his fastest riders to France. Their message was simple: come home immediately, by order of the king. The nobles who'd served Edward I gathered for the funeral, expecting continuity, tradition, stability. They believed the new king would need their guidance, their experience, their approval. They had no idea that Edward had spent 7 years planning his revenge, not with violence, but with something far more dangerous. He would use the crown itself as a weapon. Every tradition they held sacred, every protocol they demanded, every limitation they tried to impose, Edward would shatter them all. And he'd do it legally, regally, with all the power his father's conquest had accumulated. And when old King Edward finally died in 1307, his son's first act would shock every noble in England, because Edward had been planning his revenge for 7 long years. The sacred crown of St. Edward, lost though, touched by 30 kings, was now in the hands of Piers Gaveston, a foreign knight of no noble blood. Westminster Abbey fell silent as Gavaston carried England's most holy relic toward the new king. Earls who'd governed provinces, who'd led armies, who'd bled for England, watched a nobody perform the highest honour in the realm. Edward had recalled Gaveston within days of his father's death, not quietly, not gradually, but with royal fanfare that announced his intentions to everyone. The new king didn't just bring his favourite home, he made him Earl of Cornwall, a title reserved for royal blood. He granted him lands worth fortunes. He gave him power second only to the crown itself. "He's lost his mind," the Earl of Lancaster muttered to his allies. Cornwall has been a royal title for centuries. But Edward was just beginning. At the coronation feast, Gaveston's arms hung alongside royal banners. The seating arrangements placed him above dukes and earls. When nobles approached to pay homage to their new king, they found Gaveston literally standing between them and the throne. The message couldn't be clearer. To reach Edward, you went through Piers. The French delegation was stunned. They'd come to see Edward crowned and to finalise his marriage to Princess Isabella. Instead, they watched the King of England fawn over Gaveston, like a lovesick peasant. Edward wore purple, but Gaveston wore royal purple too. The king's robes were magnificent, but Gaveston's were somehow more magnificent. Every gesture, every glance between them, announced what Edward had hidden for 7 years. "This is intolerable," the Earl of Warwick said during the feast. Around him, England's most powerful men nodded agreement. They'd expected favouritism. Every king had favourites. But this went beyond precedent. Edward was rewriting the rules of power, creating a partnership that made their positions meaningless. Gaveston didn't help matters. If he'd been humble, deferential, acknowledging his incredible fortune, maybe the nobles could have stomached it. Instead, he flaunted his power with devastating wit. He created nicknames for the earls. Lancaster became the Fiddler. Warwick was the Black Dog. Lincoln was Burst Belly. These names spread through court like wildfire, turning England's mighty lords into punchlines. The coronation ceremony itself broke more traditions. Edward insisted Gaveston carry the crown, not just in procession, but actually placing it near the king's head before the archbishop could complete the blessing. Ancient protocols dictated specific roles for specific nobles. Edward shattered every one. When the Earl of Lancaster was supposed to carry the ceremonial sword, Gaveston appeared with it instead. When Warwick expected to hold the sceptre, Gaveston already had it. "He's showing us our future," Lancaster told his fellow earls after the ceremony. "Accept Gaveston or lose everything." But Gavaston carrying the crown was just the first insult. During the sacred moment when Edward swore to defend England, he kept glancing at Gavaston for approval. When nobles knelt to pledge loyalty, the new king's attention wandered to wherever Gavaston stood. The Archbishop of Canterbury later wrote that he'd never seen a coronation where the king seemed so uninterested in actually becoming king. The feast afterward turned into a Gaveston showcase. Edward had commissioned new tapestries. They depicted Gaveston's coat of arms entwined with royal symbols. The entertainment included songs about their friendship, poems about loyalty triumphing over tradition. When Edward should have been discussing realm business with his lords, he was whispering with Gaveston, sharing private jokes while England's government waited. "This cannot stand," Warwick declared at a secret meeting that night. "He's making us irrelevant." The earls were whispering words that hadn't been spoken since the days of King John: deposition, rebellion, even regicide. But they needed more than anger. They needed legal grounds, popular support, international backing. Edward had given them grievances, but grievances weren't enough to topple a king. Lancaster proposed patience. Let him destroy himself. Kings who ignore their nobles don't last long. But Warwick saw deeper. This isn't ignorance. It's deliberate. He's showing us that our opinions, our traditions, our very existence, none of it matters if he doesn't want it to. They agreed to watch, wait, and document every violation of protocol. But Edward wasn't finished shocking them. His marriage to Isabella of France was approaching, a union meant to secure peace and produce heirs. The nobles thought surely, the presence of a queen would restore some normalcy. They had no idea what Edward planned for his wedding day. Within months, those whispers would turn to plots, and Edward was about to hand them the perfect weapon at his own wedding. The 12-year-old French princess watched her new husband hand her wedding gifts to another man, in front of her uncles, in front of Europe. Isabella of France, daughter of King Philip IV, had arrived in England expecting to become the centre of Edward's world. Instead, she found herself competing with Piers Gaveston for her own husband's attention. The wedding at Boulogne Cathedral should have been Edward's chance to reset. French nobility filled the pews. Isabella's uncles, EAC, some of Europe's most powerful men, came to witness their alliance with England. The young bride wore a gown worth a fortune, golden hair adorned with jewels sent by her father. She looked like what she was, medieval perfection, a princess from fairy tales. Edward barely glanced at her during the ceremony. His eyes kept finding Gaveston in the crowd. When speaking his vows, the king rushed through them, like a merchant concluding tedious business. Isabella noticed. Everyone noticed. The French delegation exchanged glances that spoke volumes about this disrespect to their blood. But the ceremony was nothing compared to the feast. Wedding gifts poured in from across Europe: tapestries, jewels, golden plates, rare manuscripts. Traditional protocol demanded the king present these to his new queen, establishing her household and status. Instead, Edward called Gaveston forward. One by one, in full view of French royalty, the king handed treasures meant for Isabella to his favourite. "This tapestry from Burgundy. Piers, your chambers need warming. These jewels from Castle. They'll look magnificent on you." Isabella's uncle, Charles of Valois, gripped his wine goblet so tight it cracked. The insult went beyond personal. This was France itself being rejected for a Gascon nobody. The princess sat frozen, trained in royal composure, but still just 12 years old, watching her wedding become another man's celebration. Gavaston made it worse by accepting each gift with exaggerated gratitude, modelling jewellery meant for a queen, draping himself in fabrics intended for Isabella's chambers. He knew exactly what he was doing. Every smile, every pose, every theatrical gasp of delight twisted the knife deeper into French pride. "Your Majesty," Charles of Valois addressed Edward with ice in his voice, "surely the Queen should receive her wedding gifts." Edward waved dismissively. "Isabella will have everything she needs. Piers appreciates beauty more than most." The French prince's hand moved to his sword before diplomacy stayed it. Around the hall, English nobles watched this humiliation with mixed feelings. They hated Gaveston, but seeing French arrogance crushed had its appeal, until they remembered Isabella was their queen now too. Her humiliation reflected on England. The wedding night brought fresh horror. Edward spent it with Gavaston, leaving his child bride alone in the marriage chamber. Servants later testified they heard Isabella crying through the oak doors. Not dramatic wails, just the quiet tears of a girl who'd left everything familiar for a husband who preferred someone else. Isabella's uncle, Charles of Valois, was already writing letters that would change everything. Not to his brother, the French king. Not yet. First to the Pope, describing Edward's unnatural devotion that prevented consummation of a sacred marriage. Then to other European rulers, hinting at England's weakness under a distracted king. The seeds of international intervention were being planted before the wedding flowers wilted. But the worst insult was yet to come. The return journey to England became a Gaveston parade. Edward insisted his favourite ride between him and Isabella in the royal carriage. At every stop, Gaveston received the honours due to a queen. When they reached London, Edward presented Gaveston to the crowds first, Isabella second. The English people, expecting to celebrate their new queen, instead watched their king showcase his favourite. "I've never seen anything like it," the Bishop of London wrote. "The Queen might as well be invisible." Isabella maintained perfect composure throughout. Her French tutors had prepared her for difficult marriages, political unions without love, but they hadn't prepared her for complete irrelevance. She was 12, alone in a foreign country, married to a man who gave away her wedding gifts while she watched. That night in Westminster Palace, Isabella dismissed her French ladies and sat alone at her window. She could hear Edward and Gaveston laughing in nearby chambers. The sound carried through stone walls, intimate laughter, shared secrets, the comfortable joy of lovers reunited. Everything a wedding night should contain, happening without her. She began writing in her journal, a habit that would continue for years. Her first entry was brief. "I am Queen of England in name only, but names have power, and I am patient." Those who later read her journals found that entry marked with tears. But as Isabella cried in her wedding chamber, alone, she made a vow that would take 14 years to fulfill, and when she did, Edward would pay for this night with screams. Gaveston's blood was still warm when they hacked off his head. No trial, no mercy, just noble justice delivered on a muddy road. The execution on Blacklow Hill, June 19th, 1312, marked the moment England's nobility stopped pretending to respect their king's authority. It started with exile. Again, the nobles had forced Edward to banish Gavaston multiple times, but the king always found excuses to recall him. This time, they'd extracted sacred oaths. Edward swore on holy relics, on his father's soul, on the crown itself. Gavaston would stay exiled or face death. The king agreed to save his favourite's life. Edward broke that oath within months. He couldn't help himself. Letters flew to Ireland, where Gavaston waited. "Return secretly," the king wrote. "I'll protect you." But medieval England had no secrets. Every servant could be bought, every messenger interrogated. The earls knew Gaveston was coming before he landed. Lancaster mobilised first. "The king's broken his sacred oath. We're no longer bound by ours." The hunt began at Scarborough Castle, where Edward had hidden Gavaston. The earls arrived with armies, not guards, armies. They surrounded the castle like besieging a foreign enemy. When Gaveston saw the banners of Lancaster, Warwick and Hereford, he knew Edward's protection meant nothing. "Terms," Gaveston shouted from the walls. "I'll accept terms." The Earl of Pembroke, the most moderate among them, agreed to negotiate. Gaveston would surrender, travel under protection to London, receive a trial before Parliament. Pembroke swore on his honour, a medieval guarantee worth more than gold. Gavaston, trusting in aristocratic codes, opened the gates. They travelled south slowly, Pembroke's men guarding the prisoner. At Deddington they stopped for rest. Pembroke left to visit his wife nearby, trusting his men to hold Gaveston safely. That night, everything changed. The Earl of Warwick, the Black Dog, as Gaveston had mockingly named him, arrived with armed riders. "Where's your protection now?" Warwick asked, as his men dragged Gaveston from bed. They bound him like a common thief, threw him across a horse, and rode through darkness toward Warwick Castle. but Warwick had no intention of reaching his fortress. This would end on the road, away from witnesses who might testify later. At Blacklow Hill, they stopped. Lancaster was already there, waiting. The Earl of Lancaster had made his decision. Law didn't matter anymore. When kings broke oaths, when favourites returned from exile, when the realm's stability crumbled for one man's passion, then nobles made their own justice. He nodded to the executioner, a man who'd killed Scottish prisoners, who knew how to make death quick or slow. "Any last words?" Lancaster asked Gaveston. "Tell the king," Gaveston began, then stopped. What message could capture this moment? That Edward's love had killed him? That royal promises were wind? He straightened instead, finding dignity in his final moments. "I'm ready." The first blow took his head half off. The second finished it. They left his body on the roadside like executed criminals, a message written in blood. The Earl of Cornwall, Edward's beloved, the man who'd carried England's crown, ended as carrion for crows. When Edward found the body, something inside him broke forever. He'd been hunting when the news arrived, laughing moments before a messenger whispered death into his ear. The king rode alone to Blacklow Hill, dismissing his guards, needing to see for himself. Gavaston's body lay in mud, head separated, blood long dried. Edward fell to his knees beside it, gathering the corpse against his chest. Witnesses said the king made sounds they'd never heard, not quite screaming, not quite sobbing, something between animal pain and human grief. "You'll pay," Edward whispered to the air, "to England, to God himself. Every one of you will pay." He commanded Gaveston's body be retrieved with full honours. The corpse was embalmed, dressed in cloth of gold, placed in a chapel with candles burning day and night. For 2 years, Edward refused burial, visiting the preserved body, speaking to it, planning revenge while stroking dead hair. The nobles watched their king's descent into grief madness with growing alarm. They'd eliminated Gaveston to restore proper governance. Instead, they'd created something worse, a king who now hated them with focused intensity. Edward would smile in council, agree to proposals, sign documents, then return to Gaveston's corpse and whisper promises of vengeance. "We've made him dangerous," Pembroke warned the others. "Grief makes men reckless." Edward buried Gavaston with royal honours, but he'd soon learn that killing the king's favourite was just practice. The barons were planning something worse. 20,000 English soldiers watched their king turn his horse and flee. At Bannockburn, Edward II ran from Scots half his number. June 24th, 1314, became the day England discovered their king was exactly what his father had feared, a coward who preferred comfort to combat. The English army that marched to Bannockburn should have been invincible. Heavy cavalry that had crushed armies across Europe, Welsh longbowmen who could pierce armour at 200 yards, supply trains stretching for miles. Edward had assembled the largest force ever sent against Scotland, determined to finish his father's conquest and prove his critics wrong. Robert the Bruce waited with 6,000 men, outnumbered 3-1, facing England's military machine. The Scottish king had only terrain and desperation. He chose his ground carefully, boggy marshes that would trap heavy horses, narrow approaches that negated numerical advantage. While Edward's army approached in glorious display, Bruce prepared killing fields. The battle began at dawn with single combat. Henry de Bohun, an English knight, spotted Bruce alone and charged, seeing glory in killing the Scottish king. Bruce waited calmly, then split Bohun's skull with one axe blow. Scottish soldiers erupted in cheers. English knights felt the first chill of uncertainty. "Attack now," urged the Earl of Gloucester, while they're still celebrating. But Edward hesitated. The ground looked treacherous. His advisers argued about tactics. Hours passed as the king dithered, letting Bruce prepare further. When Edward finally ordered advance, the sun was high and Scottish positions were fortified. The English heavy cavalry charged into prepared spears, schiltrons, hedgehogs of death that horses couldn't break. Trapped in boggy ground, unable to manoeuvre, knights died by hundreds. Welsh arrows couldn't find targets through the press of their own men. Everything that made England's army formidable became liability in those narrow, muddy fields. But as the Scottish schiltrons advanced, Edward made a decision that would define him. He could have rallied his men, led a charge personally, died gloriously like a king should. Instead, he looked at the Scottish advance, at his dying knights, at the battle turning to slaughter, and he ran. The king's leaving. The cry spread through English ranks faster than Scottish steel. 500 chosen knights surrounded Edward as he fled. Behind them, leaderless English soldiers discovered what happens when kings abandon battlefields. Some fought to the death, maintaining honour their sovereign had discarded. Most ran, trampling each other in panic, drowning in streams, hunted through countryside by Scottish riders. His own guards would later whisper about what they saw during that flight. Edward threw away his royal banner to ride faster. He discarded armour worth fortunes. When horses died from exhaustion, he commandeered fresh ones from his own knights, leaving them to Scottish mercy. The King of England cared only for reaching safety. "Faster!" Edward screamed at every pause. "They're coming!" But the Scots weren't pursuing, they were too busy slaughtering the abandoned army. Edward fled from phantoms, from his own cowardice given form. He didn't stop until reaching Dunbar Castle, where he boarded a ship for Berwick, leaving Scottish soil forever. The scale of disaster defied comprehension. England's greatest nobles lay dead or captured. The army that could have conquered Europe was destroyed by farmers with spears. Millions in gold, armour, weapons, supplies, enriched Scotland for generations. But worse than material loss was the spiritual destruction. England had followed a coward king into battle and paid the price. "He never looked back," reported the Earl of Pembroke, one of the few nobles to survive. "Not once did our king turn to see his army dying." News of Bannockburn spread across Europe within weeks. French chroniclers delighted in England's humiliation. The Pope received reports of a king who'd inherited his father's kingdom and thrown it away in single mourning. Isabella heard the news at Windsor, where she was raising Edward's heir. Witnesses said she smiled, just slightly, before returning to her needlework. Edward reached London expecting sympathy, comfort, understanding. Instead, he found a kingdom that could barely look at him. Merchants who'd funded the campaign wanted explanations. Widows wanted to know why their husbands died while the king lived. Parliament wanted accountability for the greatest military disaster in English history. The Scots had God on their side. Edward told anyone who'd listen. But England knew better. God hadn't made Edward flee. Cowardice had. The same weakness that made him give crown jewels to favourites, that made him prefer craftsmen to warriors, had finally revealed itself when realm needed strength. As Edward fled toward England, he didn't know his wife Isabella was watching from the castle walls, and she'd finally seen enough weakness. Isabella of France stood in the French court, refusing her husband's commands to return. The little girl from the wedding had become something terrifying. By 1325, the abandoned bride had transformed into a political force that would soon earn history's darkest nickname, the She-Wolf of France. 13 years of humiliation had been Isabella's teacher. She'd learned patience, watching Edward lavish attention on Gavaston. She'd learned cunning, surviving the rise of new favourites, the Dispensers, who made Gavaston look moderate. She'd learned hatred birthing Edward's children, while he preferred his favourites' beds. Now, at age 30, she was ready to graduate from student to master. The excuse for leaving England came from Edward himself. Tensions with France over Gascony required diplomatic solutions. Who better to negotiate than the French princess who'd become England's queen? Edward, distracted by Hugh Dispenser's whispers, agreed without seeing the trap. He'd just handed his greatest enemy a legitimate reason to escape. 3 months, Isabella promised as she boarded the ship. "I'll secure peace and return." She had no intention of returning. The moment Isabella reached Paris, she began building alliances. Her brother, King Charles IV, received her with honours that highlighted what England had denied. French nobles who remembered the wedding's insults now saw Isabella's strength. She held court like the Queen Edward never let her be. Then Roger Mortimer arrived, escaped from the Tower of London, sentenced to death for rebelling against Edward. Mortimer was everything Edward wasn't. A warrior who'd never fled battle, a leader who commanded loyalty, a man who looked at Isabella and saw more than just a crown. Their alliance began as politics, but transformed into something deeper. Mortimer looked at Isabella and saw more than a queen. He saw opportunity. Together, they could offer England what Edward couldn't: competent leadership, military strength, respect for tradition. Isabella had legitimacy through blood and marriage. Mortimer had the skills to take a throne. They needed only an excuse to invade. Edward provided it by demanding their son's return. Prince Edward, heir to England's throne, had accompanied Isabella to France. The king wanted his heir back, without his mother. Isabella's response became legendary. "I will not return to England until the kingdom is purged of Hugh Dispenser, and my son stays with me." The French king, Isabella's brother, made a choice that would topple a throne. He supported his sister publicly, declaring her a wronged wife seeking justice. French gold began funding English exiles. Training camps appeared where Mortimer's followers prepared for invasion. Ships gathered in Norman ports. Europe watched Isabella transform from victim to conqueror. "She's raising an army," Hugh Dispenser warned Edward. "Your wife means to invade." Edward laughed. With what? A few exiles and French promises? England would never accept her. But Dispenser understood what Edward didn't. Isabella wasn't planning military conquest. She was orchestrating psychological warfare. Every English merchant cheated by Edward's policies, every noble disgusted by the Dispenser's greed, every widow from Bannockburn, they were Isabella's real army. She needed only to provide them a banner to rally behind. The propaganda campaign began subtly. Letters reached English shores describing Isabella's tears for her abandoned realm. Stories spread of the Queen praying for England's deliverance from evil counsellors. She positioned herself not as invader but as liberator, not as rebellious wife but as protective mother securing her son's inheritance. "I come not against the king," Isabella declared publicly, "but against those who mislead him." Everyone understood she meant the Dispensers, but the beauty of her strategy was its deniability. How could Edward punish a wife for opposing his advisers? How could he condemn a mother for protecting her son? Isabella had found the perfect balance between revolution and legitimacy. Mortimer brought military expertise to their partnership. While Isabella gathered political support, he recruited soldiers. English exiles flocked to his banner. Mercenaries from Hainault joined for gold and glory. The Count of Hainault even provided ships in exchange for his daughter's betrothal to Prince Edward. Every piece fell into place. 700 men, Mortimer told Isabella as they reviewed their forces. "It seems small for conquering England." 700 is enough, Isabella replied, "when 20,000 will join us after landing." She knew something Edward didn't. England was already conquered. The kingdom had been waiting for someone to stand against the Dispensers, against the weak king who'd failed them. Isabella offered that alternative. When her ships appeared on the English coast, she brought only 700 men, but she knew something Edward didn't about his own kingdom. Town after town opened their gates to Isabella. It wasn't an invasion, it was a homecoming parade for a conquering queen. The she-wolf landed at Orwell on September 24th, 1326, with her tiny army, and discovered that England had already surrendered in its heart. The first town's reaction set the pattern. Citizens lined the streets cheering. Merchants offered supplies freely. The local garrison not only refused to fight, they joined Isabella's march. Within hours of landing, her 700 soldiers had become 2,000. By the second day, 5,000. England wasn't being conquered. It was volunteering for regime change. Edward received the news at the Tower of London, surrounded by the Dispensers and their creatures. "She's landed with foreign troops," Hugh Dispenser reported. "But the numbers are laughable. We'll crush them within the week." The king issued proclamations condemning his wife as a traitor, promising rewards for her capture. He ordered the London militia to prepare defences. He commanded nobles to raise their levies against the invaders. The responses revealed England's true loyalty: silence from the nobles, excuses from the militia, and in London streets, people openly toasting Isabella's health. "Send the garrison from Norwich," Edward commanded. "They'll stop her advance." The Norwich garrison did march out, straight to Isabella's camp, where they knelt and swore allegiance to the Queen. Their captain explained simply, "We serve England, not the Dispensers." This scene repeated across the country. Every force Edward sent to stop Isabella became part of her army instead. The bishops provided spiritual legitimacy to the rebellion. The Bishop of Hereford, Adam Orleton, rode with Isabella's army, blessing her cause as holy. He preached sermons describing the Dispensers as demons corrupting the realm. When Edward demanded the church condemn Isabella, most bishops found urgent business elsewhere. The few who supported the king discovered their congregations had different opinions. Even Edward's own guards were starting to look at him differently. Palace servants reported whispered conversations, guards discussing when, not if, to switch sides. The king couldn't trust his own household. Paranoia gripped Westminster as Edward realized his isolation. "We should negotiate," suggested the Earl of Winchester, one of the few remaining loyalists. "Negotiate?" Hugh Dispenser's voice cracked. "With that witch? She'll have our heads." Dispenser was right about his own fate, but he'd misread the situation. Isabella's propaganda specifically targeted the favourites, not the king. She maintained the fiction of rescuing Edward from evil counsellors. This gave wavering nobles the excuse they needed. They weren't rebelling against their anointed king, merely removing corrupting influences. Leicester opened its gates with celebration. Nottingham surrendered without a shot. Oxford students composed songs about Isabella's beauty and courage. Town after town, castle after castle, the infrastructure of royal power simply changed hands. Isabella didn't need to besiege or threaten. England was giving itself to her. When London opened its gates to Isabella, Edward knew he was finished. The capital's betrayal was absolute. Merchants who'd suffered under dispenser monopolies rang church bells in celebration. The mob attacked symbols of royal power, but carefully, they burned records of dispensers' transactions while protecting crown jewels for Isabella. Even in revolution, they maintained the distinction between bad government and the institution of monarchy. "We leave tonight," Edward told the dispensers. "Gather what gold you can." The king's flight west began in darkness, a sorry procession of perhaps 50 loyalists. Behind them, London erupted in celebration. Isabella entered the city in triumph, Prince Edward at her side, Mortimer commanding her troops. Citizens who'd cowered under Edward's rule now cheered themselves hoarse for their liberating queen. Long live Queen Isabella. Death to the dispensers. Isabella played her part perfectly. She wore white, the colour of innocence and widowhood. Though her husband lived, she carried religious relics, positioning herself as heaven's agent. When crowds pressed close, she didn't retreat behind guards but reached out, touching hands, accepting flowers. Being the queen Edward never let her be. The psychological victory was complete. Edward II, King of England, anointed by God, was running through his own kingdom like a criminal. Isabella, technically still just his wife, ruled in all but name. The invasion that should have been impossible, Prop. 700 soldiers conquering a nation, had succeeded because England wanted to be conquered. Parliament assembled without royal summons, technically illegal but universally supported. They declared the dispensers enemies of the realm. They confirmed Isabella's authority as regent for her son. They did everything but officially depose Edward, a thing that would come later, with proper theatrical staging. Edward had one last companion as he fled, Hugh Dispenser, but Isabella had special plans for him that would make Gavaston's death look merciful. They started with Dispenser's genitals, cutting them off and burning them in front of his eyes while the crowd cheered for more. November 24th, 1326. Hereford Marketplace became a theatre of revenge where Isabella's justice played out in flesh and screams. The capture had been pathetic. Edward and the Dispensers reached Wales, hoping for ships to Ireland, but Isabella's agents had preceded them. No captain would risk sailing. Local lords, who owed everything to Edward, suddenly discovered urgent business elsewhere. After weeks of desperate flight, they were cornered at Neath Abbey, UHE, a king of England arrested like a common fugitive by his wife's soldiers. They separated Edward from the Dispensers immediately. The king would face formal deposition. Isabella needed legitimacy for her son's succession, but the Dispensers were different. They were criminals, convicted by Parliament, and medieval justice for traitors followed specific traditions. Hugh Dispenser, the younger, would experience every one. The trial was theatre. Dispenser stood before judges who'd already decided his fate, charged with crimes everyone knew he'd committed: corrupting the king, stealing lands, murdering opponents. The specific charges mattered less than the symbolism. England was purging itself of corruption through Dispenser's body. "You have dishonoured knighthood," the judge proclaimed, "so you'll die unknightly." They stripped Dispenser naked and dragged him to the scaffold on a hurdle, denying him the dignity of walking. The crowd that gathered defied counting, thousands upon thousands, drawn by promises of spectacular vengeance. Isabella watched from a window, Mortimer beside her. The Queen, who'd endured 14 years of humiliation, would see her tormentor destroyed. The executioner began with symbols. They crowned Dispenser with nettles, a mockery of the power he'd wielded. They hung a biblical verse around his neck about the fate of evil counselors. They marked his body with the reversed arms of his house. Each act carried meaning the crowd understood. This wasn't just execution, it was a moral lesson written in flesh. "Begin with what he valued most," someone shouted from the crowd. The executioner understood. Dispenser had used his manhood to dominate, to father children who might inherit his stolen gains. So they started there, with the careful cuts that separated him from masculinity. The crowd fell silent as Dispenser screamed, not from sympathy, but to better hear his agony. When the executioner held up the severed parts before throwing them into the fire, the cheering resumed. But the disemboweling was just the beginning of the show. Medieval execution for treason followed a precise script. After emasculation came the belly cut, not deep enough to kill quickly, just sufficient to pull out intestines. The executioner was an artist who knew how to keep victims conscious through unimaginable pain. Dispenser watched his own organs burn, steam rising from the brazier, smell of cooking meat filling the marketplace. "For Gavaston," someone yelled, reminding everyone how this cycle of revenge began. The executioner moved to Dispenser's chest, making the cuts that would extract his heart while it still beat. This was the climax. The traitor's heart burned before his dying eyes. The symbolism was perfect. Dispenser had corrupted Edward's heart, so his own would burn as punishment. The crowd counted beats as the executioner held the still-moving organ high. Only after the heart burned did they allow Dispenser to die. The beheading was mercy after what preceded it. His body was quartered, parts sent to decorate city gates across England. The head went to London, displayed on the bridge where thousands would see it. Isabella had promised to purge England of the Dispensers. They was one. She delivered spectacularly. Edward watched from his prison window, knowing he was next. They'd moved him to Kenilworth Castle, where the Earl of Lancaster, cousin to the Lancaster who'd killed Gavaston, kept him under comfortable but strict confinement. The king who'd ruled England now occupied a single tower, watching his kingdom celebrate his destruction. "Your wife shows mercy," Lancaster told Edward. "You'll be deposed, not executed." But Edward understood Isabella better. She couldn't kill an anointed king openly. That would destroy her legitimacy. But accidents happened. Deposed kings had unfortunate habits of dying mysteriously. Richard II had shown that precedent. Edward knew his survival was temporary, lasting only until Isabella found the right method. The deposition ceremony in January 1327 was humiliation perfected. Parliament declared Edward had broken his coronation oath through incompetence. They offered him a choice: abdicate voluntarily, or watch his son be disinherited too. Edward wept as he agreed, handing over the crown he'd disgraced. Prince Edward became Edward III, with Isabella as regent and Mortimer as protector. They took Edward to Berkeley Castle, where the dungeons had been specially prepared, because Isabella had learned that sometimes death wasn't enough. The stench from the pit below Edward's cell was so thick you could taste it. Rotting animals piled deep, a king drowning in decay. Berkeley Castle's dungeon had been modified specifically for its royal prisoner, transformed from simple prison to psychological torture chamber. Lord Berkeley later claimed ignorance, but the modifications required planning. They dug a pit beneath Edward's cell, connected to the castle's waste systems. Dead sheep, cattle, horses, anything that rotted, went into that pit. The smell rose through gaps in the flooring, creating an atmosphere that burned eyes and destroyed appetite. Medieval medicine believed bad air caused disease. Edward's jailers were literally trying to poison him with stench. "He refuses to eat," reported the guard to Maltravers, one of Edward's keepers. "Then he'll starve," Maltravers replied. "We're not forcing food on him." But Edward wouldn't die easily. Weeks passed in that fetid cell, the former king growing gaunt but clinging to life. He'd survived on rage after Gavaston's death. Now he survived on spite, refusing to give Isabella the convenient death she wanted. Every morning the guards expected to find a corpse. Every morning Edward still breathed, still lived, still created a problem. The psychological torture went beyond smell. They denied him hot water for washing, forcing a king who'd loved fine clothes to wallow in filth. They removed furniture piece by piece, first the chairs, then the table, finally even the straw mattress. Edward slept on stone floors slick with moisture from the rot below. When he begged for basic dignity, guards laughed. "You're no king now," they reminded him daily. "Just a prisoner who won't die." Isabella grew impatient. Her regency depended on Edward's death looking natural. A murdered king created martyrs, invited rebellion, questioned legitimacy. But a king who died from poor health in prison, gentle slash. That was merely unfortunate. She needed Edward dead, without violence, or at least without obvious violence. The solution came in a letter. Edwardum occidere nolit, timere bonum est. The Latin message arrived at Berkeley in September 1327. Depending on punctuation, it read either, "Do not kill Edward, it is good to fear," or "Kill Edward, do not fear, it is good." The ambiguity was deliberate. If questioned, Isabella could claim she'd ordered Edward's protection, but Maltravers and his fellow jailer Gurney understood the real meaning. "She wants it done," Gurney said after reading the letter 3 times, but without marks. They'd already tried suffocation, pressing cushions over Edward's face while he slept. But the former king had developed paranoid alertness, waking at the slightest sound. They'd tried exposure, leaving windows open during storms, hoping pneumonia would finish what the dungeon stench started. Edward wrapped himself in whatever rags remained and survived. The guards noticed Edward had stopped praying. The man who'd once heard daily mass now ignored the chapel bells. When a priest offered confession, Edward laughed, a sound that chilled even hardened jailers. He'd moved beyond faith into something darker, sustained by hatred alone. "He's waiting," one guard whispered to another. "Waiting for what?" "For us to finish it," his companion replied. "He knows what's coming." The letter changed everything. Isabella had given permission in the most deniable way possible. Maltravers and Gurney began planning the specifics. The method needed to be painful. Their hatred for Edward demanded that. But it also needed to leave no external marks, no evidence for enemies to display. Medieval creativity rose to the challenge. "Fire," Gurney suggested, but internal. The plan they developed was ingenious in its cruelty. A heated metal rod inserted through a horn into the body would burn from inside out. No external wounds for investigators to find. The horn would protect against telltale burn marks around the entry point. The death would be agonizing but technically invisible, perfect for their needs. They prepared carefully. The horn was selected for size and strength. The iron rod was measured precisely. A portable brazier was acquired to heat the metal in Edward's cell. They even scheduled the exact time, late night, when sounds travelled less, when other prisoners would be sleeping deeply. When Isabella's letter arrived, the jailer read it 3 times before understanding its deadly grammar. September 21st was chosen for practical reasons. The harvest season meant nearby villagers would be exhausted from work, sleeping deeply. The castle garrison was reduced, many soldiers away on patrol. Fewer witnesses meant fewer questions later. Edward sensed the change immediately. His jailers stopped their daily taunts. The guards avoided eye contact. Even the stench seemed less important. Why worry about slow death when quick death approached? On the night of September 21st, they brought 3 items to Edward's cell: a horn, an iron rod, and a brazier of glowing coals. The horn was to protect against external wounds, the heated rod to destroy from within. Someone had thought this through. As Edward's killers entered his cell that September night, they carried instruments of medieval ingenuity designed for one purpose: invisible regicide. Maltravers led the way, Gurney followed with the brazier, and a third man, never officially named, carried the metal implements. They'd rehearsed this moment, discussed logistics with disturbing precision. The horn would guide the heated rod internally, preventing telltale burns around the entry point. The rod itself had been selected for length and width, tested in the forge until it glowed with perfect heat. "Hold him," Maltravers commanded unnecessarily. Edward wasn't fighting. The deposed king looked at his murderers with strange calm. Months of torture had prepared him for this ending. He'd imagined dozens of death methods during those stinking nights. Poison, strangulation, a knife between ribs, all seemed plausible. But even Edward's darkest predictions hadn't conceived this specific cruelty. They forced him onto his stomach, pinning arms and legs with practiced efficiency. The third man positioned the horn while Gurney heated the rod in glowing coals. The cell filled with the metallic smell of heating iron, mixing with the perpetual stench of decay. Edward could hear the soft hiss of metal growing white-hot, could feel the heat radiating across the small space. "Any last words?" Maltravers asked, perhaps from protocol, perhaps from cruelty. Edward turned his head, meeting his killer's eyes. "She wins," he whispered, then louder, finding strength. "But not forever. My son, thank." They stuffed rags in his mouth before he could finish. The prophecy of a father's revenge was the last thing they wanted, echoing through Berkeley Castle. Gurney lifted the rod from the coals, its tip glowing like a fallen star. The third man ensured the horn was properly positioned. Maltravers kept Edward pinned despite the king's sudden, desperate struggles. As they heated the rod, Edward finally understood what was about to happen. The sophisticated cruelty of it, the symbolic violation, the guarantee of agony. His wife had outdone herself. This wasn't just murder, but degradation, designed to destroy dignity along with life. He tried to scream through the gags, producing only muffled sounds that pleased his killers. The insertion was swift. Mercy would have been slower, more careful. The heated metal burned through internal organs instantly, cauterizing as it destroyed. Edward's body convulsed with impossible force, nearly throwing off his captors. The muffled screaming became something inhuman, primal agony, given voice. The horn had done its job. No external burns, just invisible destruction within. The first villager to wake thought it was an animal being slaughtered. Berkeley Village sat close enough to hear castle sounds on quiet nights, but this wasn't normal butchery noise. The screaming continued, rose, became something that bypassed ears, and struck directly at primitive fear. Windows shuttered quickly. Parents covered children's ears. Everyone understood without words. When you hear such sounds from a castle, you stay silent. "Christ," Gurney muttered, unprepared for the duration of agony. He'd expected quick death, not this prolonged torture. But human bodies are resilient, even in extremity. Edward lived through minutes that seemed like hours, each second an eternity of pain. The rod cooled slightly, so they heated another. The second insertion broke what remained of Edward's voice, reducing screams to rasping wheezes. Still he lived, heart refusing to stop, lungs refusing to quit. "Finish it," Maltravers ordered, disturbed despite himself. The third application ended Edward II's earthly suffering. The king who'd inherited England's throne, who'd loved unwisely and ruled worse, died on a dungeon floor with heated metal inside him. His last expression, witnesses disagreed whether it showed agony or strange peace, would haunt his killer's dreams. They left the body until dawn, ensuring death was absolute. No marks appeared on Edward's skin. The horn had worked perfectly. When Lord Berkeley was summoned to confirm the death, he found a corpse that might have died from any cause. Only the smell of burned flesh, mingling with dungeon stench, suggested violence. "Natural causes," Berkeley reported to Isabella's agents. The former king's health finally failed. Edward II was dead, but his son, Edward III, was already planning revenge, YS, and he'd start with the man who'd shared his mother's bed. The perfect murder had one flaw: it created a perfect motive for vengeance. The villagers found excuses to avoid Berkeley Castle for weeks after that night. They'd heard the screaming, understood its meaning, and chose survival through silence. When Edward II's death was announced as natural causes, no one contradicted the official story. But mothers still quieted children with warnings: behave, or you'll scream like the king in the castle. Isabella received the news at Lincoln, where she was holding court with Mortimer. Witnesses reported she showed no emotion beyond brief satisfaction. The woman who'd endured 14 years of humiliation, who'd watched her husband give away her wedding gifts, who'd been abandoned for male favourites, she'd won completely. Edward was dead, her son was king, and she ruled England through both. "The former king has passed," she announced to the court. "We pray for his soul." But young Edward III was watching everything. At 15, he understood more than his mother realised. He'd seen Mortimer's growing arrogance, watched his mother's transformation from liberator to tyrant. The boy king bided his time, learning patience from Isabella's own example. She'd waited 14 years for revenge. He could wait 3. The execution came at Nottingham Castle in 1330. Edward III's men burst into Mortimer's chamber through a secret passage, dragging him from Isabella's bed. The Queen's screams, "Fair son, have pity on gentle Mortimer," echoed through stone corridors, but her son was done with mercy. Mortimer hanged at Tyburn like a common criminal, denied even the dignity of beheading. Isabella herself received gentler justice. Edward III couldn't execute his mother, but he could imprison her. She spent 27 years in comfortable captivity, living in castles with servants and luxuries but no power. The she-wolf was defanged, allowed to grow old, remembering when England trembled at her name. But the story didn't end with Isabella's imprisonment. In 1338, a letter reached Europe's courts that rewrote history. Manuel Fieschi, an Italian priest, claimed Edward II hadn't died at Berkeley. Instead, he'd escaped during the murder attempt, fled to Ireland, then wandered Europe as a hermit. Fieschi described meetings with Edward in Germany, conversations about his lost throne, a broken king finding peace in anonymity. "I have spoken with him myself," Fieschi wrote. "He showed me signs only Edward would know." Was it possible? Medieval Europe was full of pretenders, false princes claiming lost thrones, but Fieschi was respectable, connected to the papal court, with no obvious motive for lies. His letter contained details about Edward's captivity that few knew. It described scars, mannerisms, private information that gave credibility to impossibility. Some historians believe the screaming at Berkeley was staged, that sympathizers smuggled Edward out during chaos. They point to the closed coffin funeral, the refusal to let nobles view the body. Isabella's perfect murder might have been too perfect, creating a corpse so mutilated that switching bodies became possible. Others dismiss Fieschi as medieval conspiracy theory. They argue that Edward's survival makes no political sense. Why wouldn't he contact his son? Why live as hermit when he could reclaim power? The letter might be wishful thinking, Europe's inability to accept such a grotesque regicide. The truth died with medieval witnesses, but the legend persisted. Sightings of a tall, haunted man in German monasteries, speaking English with royal inflections. Pilgrims reported encounters with a hermit who wept when discussing England. True or false, these stories revealed medieval discomfort with Isabella's justice. Edward II's death marked medieval kingship's darkest moment. A man born to rule, trained for power, anointed by God, the record, reduced to screaming meat in a dungeon. His preferences for male companions, his rejection of martial values, his inability to play the brutal game of medieval politics, EIS, all led to that horn and heated rod. But perhaps the cruelest irony was this: Edward's death accomplished nothing. His son Edward III became everything his father wasn't: a warrior king who conquered France, who ruled with iron strength, who never let favourites overwhelm wisdom. The murder meant to secure Isabella's power instead created her destroyer. In death, Edward II achieved what he'd never managed alive. He became a cautionary tale that echoed through centuries. Every king who followed understood the lesson written in his screams. Medieval monarchy was blood sport, and weakness was the only unforgivable sin.